Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the trucking industry in 2025. Specifically, we have this fascinating article from Transport Topics, and this was published right at the start of the second Trump administration. So it kind of gives us a snapshot of where the industry was at that moment and maybe some hints of where it was going. So for all of you listening out there who are interested in mention the listeners' provided interests, get ready for some insights on electric trucks, those crazy lawsuits that have been making headlines, and the whole regulatory landscape.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time for the industry right now. A lot of uncertainty, but also a lot of potential opportunity as well. And this article really gives us this peek into how the industry is kind of trying to deal with all these challenges and changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of challenges, one of the first things the article talks about is Chris Spear, the president of the American Trucking Associations. He actually met with Trump back when he was still a candidate in June of 2024. And Spear left that meeting feeling pretty optimistic, apparently. It makes you wonder, what kind of promises were made out there on the campaign trail.
Right. Yeah, that direct line of communication between the industry leaders and a presidential candidate is pretty significant. It suggests that the trucking industry had, maybe a pretty big voice when it came to shaping policy.
Yeah, that's true. And one of the things that Spear seemed most concerned about was the California Air Resources Board, CARB, and their push for these electric truck mandates. I mean, he makes this pretty stark comparison in the article. He says it takes 15 minutes to fuel up a diesel truck for a 1,200-mile trip. But 6 to 8 hours to charge an electric truck to go a measly 200 miles. I mean, that's a massive difference when you think about efficiency and downtime.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, CRB has always been out there on the leading edge of environmental regulations. Often they kind of set the standards for the rest of the country.
Yeah.
So their push for electric trucks is ambitious. There's no doubt about that. But like Spear pointed out, there are some serious logistical challenges that need to be figured out.
Right, yeah. Is there a risk that these mandates could actually backfire? If the technology and the infrastructure aren't really there yet, could it end up hurting the very businesses and consumers that they're trying to protect?
Yeah, it's a valid concern. This rapid transition to electric trucks without enough charging stations and support could definitely disrupt the supply chain.
Right.
It could also lead to higher prices. So it's like walking a tightrope trying to balance, pushing for progress and making sure the industry can still function.
Right. And it's not just Spear who's worried about this. The article mentions that the Truckload Carriers Association, the TCA, they also want a slower rollout of these regulations. They actually supported a letter to the EPA urging them to rethink these Phase 3 emission standards for the heavy-duty vehicles.
Yeah, and it's interesting because over 150 Republican members of Congress also signed that letter.
Yeah.
So it looks like there might be some bipartisan support for the industry's position there, which could be, a pretty powerful force when it comes to shaping policy.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting how these issues can kind of bring together some unlikely allies. But, regulations are just one piece of the puzzle here. The article also talks about these so-called nuclear lawsuits that have been hitting the industry hard. These cases with these massive jury awards that could really cripple a company. They mention this one example, this $462 million verdict against Wabash National after a fatal crash involving one of their trailers.
Yeah, and that's not even an isolated incident, unfortunately. There was another one, a $160 million verdict against Daimler Truck North America in a separate case. So these huge payouts are definitely creating a lot of anxiety for the industry.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, it's understandable that companies are concerned. One lawsuit could wipe out years of profits. So what are some of the solutions that are being considered to address this issue?
Well, one idea that's being tossed around is this federal legislation to move these cases from state court to federal court. The thinking is that federal courts might be less likely to hand out these massive awards.
Makes sense. So it sounds like the trucking industry is facing pressure from all sides right now, from environmental regulations to these lawsuits and everything in between. And the article goes on to say that there are predictions of a regulatory slowdown in 2025. So does that mean the industry is off the hook? Are they going to get a free pass?
Probably not. I mean, while the second Trump administration might ease up on some regulations, others are probably still going to move forward, like the FMCSA, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. They'll likely finalize those changes to their compliance safety accountability program. And they might even keep going with those safety fitness determinations for carriers.
So even with the slowdown, there's still a lot on the horizon in terms of regulations. But let's switch gears for a minute and talk about something kind of fascinating, automated trucks. Do you think that this new administration is going to provide more clarity when it comes to the regulations surrounding this rapidly evolving technology?
Yeah, that's a really key question. Yeah, the technology is definitely developing way faster than the regulations can keep up. And that lack of clarity is creating a lot of uncertainty for the industry. Some companies are ready to jump in and embrace automation, and others are more hesitant. They want to see how things play out first.
Yeah, it really does feel like the Wild West out there with all this new technology coming out. But, speaking of uncertainty, the article made a really interesting point about this being Trump's second term. It's kind of being framed as like a do-over, a chance for him to maybe take a more streamlined approach to tackling some of these really complicated issues.
That's interesting. Makes you wonder if his experience from the first term will actually translate into faster action and, more efficient implementation from the agencies that actually have to, put these policies into practice.
Right. Yeah. Like, will they be able to keep up with all these changes that are happening so quickly? The article did highlight some predictions for the coming year. And this one guy, Sean Garney, he's the co-director at Scopolitis Transportation Consulting. He said that this second term could give the administration a chance to be more focused and efficient, especially when it comes to issues that are specific to trucking.
Yeah, maybe. If they can streamline the regulations and make things clearer, especially on key issues like automation, that could create a much more stable and predictable environment for the industry.
For sure, for sure. But let's bring it back to you, our listener, for a second. What does all this mean for someone who's interested in mention the listeners' provided interests? How does all this stuff happening in the trucking industry connect to your world?
Well, I think the main takeaway here is that the trucking industry is kind of at a crossroads. It's facing all these challenges and all these opportunities at the same time. And whatever happens next is going to shape its future. And that future has implications for everybody you know. Yeah. The cost of goods, the environment, even the job market. It's all connected to the trucking industry in some way.
Yeah, totally. I mean, think about it. Almost everything you buy has been on a truck at some point. So the decisions that these policymakers and industry leaders are making, they're going to impact your wallet and maybe even your lifestyle.
Exactly. And then there's the environmental side of things. Like we talked about earlier, CARB is pushing for this really fast adoption of electric trucks in California. But as Beer pointed out, there are these huge logistical problems that need to be solved. If they don't figure those out, it could mess up the supply chain. And then prices could go up even more for consumers.
Right, right. And we can't forget about the workforce either. Automation is this big question mark hanging over the industry. Some people think it'll create new jobs, and others are worried it'll lead to tons of truck drivers losing their jobs. Whatever the government decides to do is going to play a huge role in how this all shakes out.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about. But that's why these deep dives are so important, They give us a chance to step back from all the headlines and really dig into the complicated stuff that's shaping our world.
For sure. And hopefully they'll give our listeners the information they need to make good decisions and start some conversations about these important topics.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of good decisions, let's go back to those nuclear lawsuits for a minute. The article didn't really go into detail about solutions, but they did mention moving those cases to federal court. What do you think about that?
Well, it's definitely an interesting idea. The people who like this idea say that federal courts are less likely to give out those crazy huge amounts of money, like we've seen in some of those recent cases. They think it could create a more predictable legal system for the industry and maybe even lower insurance costs.
Yeah, but on the other hand, some people are saying that moving these cases to federal court could make it harder for everyday people and small businesses to get justice, if they've been harmed by a trucking company. So it's really complicated.
Yeah, there are definitely consequences on both sides. Sounds like there's no easy answer, but it's important to have these discussions and explore every possible solution. As we're talking about these challenges, I keep thinking about automation. It just feels like it could be a game changer.
Yeah, I agree. If we do it right, automation could make things safer, and it could lower labor costs, and even reduce the impact trucking has on the environment. But it also brings up a whole bunch of new questions.
Right, like how do we know these self-driving trucks are going to be safe and reliable? And what about all the truck drivers who might lose their jobs? How do we help them? And what about the impact on communities that rely on trucking for jobs?
All good questions. And it's not just about the technology itself. We need to come up with clear rules and ethical guidelines for how to use these autonomous vehicles. It's a tricky situation with lots of potential, but also lots of potential problems.
Wow. Yeah, it really does feel like we're just at the beginning of a whole new era for trucking.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Mm.
And it's going to impact the economy and, our whole society.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. We've covered a ton of ground today. Electric trucks, those nuclear lawsuits, regulations, self-driving trucks. What do you think are the most important things for our listeners to remember?
Hmm. Well, I think the big thing is that the trucking industry is going through some huge changes. Environmental concerns, new technology, the legal stuff.
Yeah.
And it could change everything.
Hmm.
How much things cost, jobs, the environment.
Right. It's like even though trucking seems kind of ordinary, it's actually connected to all these big problems we're dealing with.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to stay informed and,
Yeah.
be part of these conversations. Because the decisions that are made by the government, the industry, even us as consumers,
Yeah.
are going to shape the future of trucking.
And the future of our society.
Exactly.
So here's a final thought for everyone listening. How do you think the relationship between the trucking industry and the government is going to change in the next few years? Will they work together more, or will there be more conflict? Will regulations slow down progress or help steer it in the right direction?
Yeah. And how will all of this affect your life? These are tough questions.
Yeah.
But by learning about them and staying curious, you can be part of shaping the future of this industry.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of trucking. Hopefully it made you think about this industry in a new way
Mhm.
and, maybe even got you a little excited about the future.